welcome to today's Christian Concern live stream. Since the lockdown began, we've been here on Friday lunchtimes with you every week, sharing some of the most interesting stories of the week and giving you a chance to join us, make your comments, ask your questions, and understand a little bit more about the work that we do. My name's Paul Huxley. I'm the Communications Manager at Christian Concern, and I'm filling in this week for Tim Dieppe and Ben John, who often host this show. They unfortunately can't be with us this week, so you've got me instead. But you'll be glad to know that I have some of the very finest and most experienced members of the team to keep me in check. First of all, Andrea Williams, our Chief Executive at Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. Welcome, Andrea.
Great to be with you.
And also Roger Kiszka from the Christian Legal Centre, all the way from Slovakia. Hi, Roger. You're on mute still, I'm afraid, Roger.
Technical difficulties, but pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Here in south of England, we're really glad that the sun, well, I'm really glad that the sun has abated a little bit. It's less stormy. It's feeling good here. I don't know what it's like in Slovakia. Is it hot?
It's hot. Yeah, it's been in the 30s for a few days now.
So good effort to wear your shirt and tie. So excellent job there. And we're delighted to be joined today by Emma Webb. She is the director of the Forum on Integration, Democracy and Extremism for the think tank Civitas. Her latest report, Fallen Through the Cracks, looks at the problem of unregistered Islamic marriages in England and Wales and argues that it should be mandatory to register all religious marriages. Emma, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
So this is what we're going to talk about to start off with, this issue of unregistered marriages. It might be quite a distant one for many of our viewers, many Christians who may not have really come across this before. So can you explain to us what is happening in broad terms and why this report focuses on Islamic unregistered marriages?
Yeah, so essentially, I think something that is, like you said, remote for most Christians, because in the UK, when you get married in a church or, particularly if you're Anglican, your marriage will sort of be automatically recognised, and most people would assume that religious marriages are just automatically recognised. But the marriage legislation is actually quite old, and it only really recognises Christian, Quaker, Jewish marriages, and doesn't automatically recognise Muslim marriages. So there are lots of people who, and in fact, I had some of the statistics here with me. So there was a study done in 2017, and we had privileged access to look at the original statistics that they'd done for this Channel 4 study, and 60.1% of the people that were surveyed, so 99% of them had a nikah marriage, so a Sharia only marriage, and 60.1% of those had no civil marriage in addition to that, and over a quarter of them didn't realize that their marriage wasn't legally recognized. So often what happens is women will enter into these religious only marriages, and then find out later when they get divorced, they have absolutely no marital rights, no rights to shared assets. They end up with, being sort of exploited, or, having to enter into informal custody arrangements to get their religious divorces, and sometimes being left completely destitute with no rights to anything. The courts can't intervene because the marriage isn't recognised by civil law. It's essentially not a marriage. And so they end up in horrible situations, and sometimes these women have already experienced domestic abuse and other traumatic things. And so it's just for these people, it's a complete nightmare. And unless those marriages are recognised legally or civilly registered, then there really isn't anything that can be done to protect them and make sure that they've got access to their rights, like every other community in the UK has. So it's a real problem, and I think there were some similar issues that happened, less now, I think, than previously, because some legislative changes were made to deal with it. But within the Jewish community, there were similar problems of what they called the chained woman, where women get stuck in a religious marriage where the husband refuses to divorce her. But the difference there was that most Jewish marriages tend to be registered under civil law, whereas we don't actually know, by virtue of the fact that they're unregistered, how many of these there are. And some estimates suggest that there are up to 20,000 polygamous marriages in the UK, possibly more than that, again, because they're unregistered. So men can get around the laws of bigamy by entering into multiple religious-only marriages with these women in this completely asymmetric relationship, where they can just be divorced in an instant and then find themselves completely destitute.
One of the amazing things I picked up in the report, it's this information that the Muslim Women's Network reported that over half the cases dealt with at Birmingham Central Mosque Sharia Council, quote, involved couples who were not married under English civil law.
Mm-hmm.
Half the cases, presumably that's a fairly major mosque and Sharia court.
Yeah, it's a serious problem because, I mean, like I say, we don't know how many people are in this situation. One of the recommendations of the report is that we need an awareness raising campaign so that people realise that their marriages are not recognised by the law. Something similar to maybe what was done with FGM, but we are actually under international obligations we signed various things like we signed the Istanbul Convention. There's a European Council resolution that requires us to take action on this. There have been, pressures from internal government reviews and investigations and reports, and from pressure groups who have been saying for years that we need to recognise this. We need to raise awareness about what's going on, and we need to change the law to make sure that the women are not in these situations. Because sometimes, and some of the case studies in the report show this, that when women go to these Sharia councils, they just experience more sort of discrimination and abuse, where they end up feeling like they're second-class citizens, being made to sit on the floor while the men sit in chairs, being encouraged to go and reconcile with abusive husbands, even in some cases where there have been court injunctions. Because they've been in an abusive relationship, and the Sharia councils have still encouraged them to reconcile with their husbands. And in some cases, in return for the divorce, they're asked for informal custody arrangements where they're being asked to hand over their children over to a husband that may have sexually abused them or domestically abused them. In return for the divorce. In some cases, they, even though they're probably being left destitute, because they always end up with the short straw when it comes to the division of assets, because they don't have any legal rights to them. Sometimes they also find themselves being financially exploited, where they're asking for increasingly large sums of money in return for a divorce. So I think there are lots of women around the country who probably don't even realise that their marriages don't have legal status. These marriages can take place in the back room of a shop. There's no there are no sort of regulations around where these marriages take place and how they do, because it's culturally different to the way that Christian marriages take place. So they can traditionally take place in the home, and so there's just no legal recognition, and therefore they have no legal rights.
It must be a real headache to try and actually get to the bottom of some of this, given that so much of it seems to be behind closed doors. Andrew, I just want to remind our viewers, please get in your questions and comments. If you want to ask Emma anything, then please do put it in there and we'll try to get to it. But I want to come to Andrea to ask for her kind of reaction to this with her experience of some of these sorts of situations.
Well, I think that in family law, and certainly in domestic and sexual abuse type of situations, we see the way in which women in particular are often in great fear, even those not in Islamic situations. You see them being fearful, unable to access the court system, themselves feeling very violated, not knowing where to go for advocacy. Imagine if the women are also in a situation whereby they have no recourse at all to the system, to law, because their marriage is not recognised within the legal system. And we do, as Emma has said, we know that this is real. We know that this is particularly real within Islamic marriages. And I have real experience of this when we were working very closely with Shan, who herself had been groomed by a Muslim gang over many years. She herself was held captive for almost a decade by them. by a gang of 6. She was raped systematically by them, but also married and divorced 3 times in that period. Twice she wasn't present for the marriage. Now, this is an English girl.
So these are obviously under UK law, these are non-marriages, but under Islamic law, they are.
Under Islamic law, they would have been marriages. What's very interesting about the way in which she was groomed was that she believed that she was being married to them. She was married to the leader of the gang, then to another one of the members of the gang. And she also, because of the way in which I suppose the kind of abuse works, is that she had very strong feelings for the leader of the gang in particular. But something that also happened to her was this, and I went to see the home where she had been held captive. It was really close to a little shopping arcade. She could have escaped. She never did. It was within 1.5 miles of a police station. She did not escape. Now, this was real. This was a girl born and bred in the UK, but who'd become involved in just become a victim of the grooming gangs. And this, we know, is one story of many. And it is fascinating to think that she, even within this situation, and when she was entirely subjugated within it, that she believed that her marriages were real, but could not break out at all from the situation that she was in.
So Emma, you got lots of case studies in the report of these sorts of situations. Do you want to share some of the sorts of situations that came up as you were looking through those?
Yeah, so one of the ones that really stands out to me, and I can't really, I mean, a lot of these people, you know, I did interviews with them, and it's enough to keep you awake at night, some of the horrible things that they've experienced, and the domestic abuse and things like that. And they're sort of stuck within, in some cases, and this is not just the case with, you know, within the Muslim community in Britain. It's something that you can see examples in the report. I actually started with an analogy to the Netflix series Unorthodox, because the character in that finds herself in a situation where she talks about there being a sort of an electric fence. It's just social pressure not to run away, as Andrea was saying, not to leave, not to be able to get out of the situation. And if you, in order to get a divorce, as some of these women, you know, the men can divorce them in an instant, whereas they have to go through this whole process, and it can take a long time, and it can be very expensive. And in the process, they're made to jump through all of these hoops that might feel impossible to them. And, you know, they're already, in some cases, extremely traumatized by the things that have happened to them. And then they go to the Sharia courts, and the Sharia courts are encouraging them to reconcile, even though they may not want to. And you know, some of these women have found themselves with absolutely nothing, completely destitute. One woman said that she felt suicidal, and she was only living for her children. And you know, they find themselves in a situation where they basically lost everything. And especially if you're in a polygamous relationship as well, that, you know, a man who has multiple wives, and the relationship there is obviously inherently asymmetric, there's a sort of precariousness if the woman could just be dropped in an instant, and to lose everything that she has. There's no stability in that relationship whatsoever. She's got nothing to sort of fall back on, and the law can't intervene to help her. So some of the women, you know, it was quite clear that they felt that their situation had been aggravated by having to be reliant on the Sharia councils, that they felt were treating them badly as well by encouraging them to go, you know, back into relationships with people who have been abusing them. And you know, there's no evidence for like how widespread this is, because it's taking place behind closed doors. There are only a few women who've been willing to speak out publicly. Some of the people that we've spoken to weren't willing to speak out publicly. You know, that many of the names in the report have been changed, gathered together from different sources, that people have been accumulating these case studies over many years. And the point is actually that this evidence has been mounting for so many years, and each case study, each story, each interview, well, it's very different. Some of these people have been, the enforced marriages where they've been sent abroad and ended up stuck there, and then, or they've been in relationships with people who were trying to get citizenship, and all sorts of different dimensions to this problem. But what it really boils down to is simply that the women need legal protection, and that's what it really boils down to, because there are all of these disparate perspectives to the different experiences, and different perspectives from different activist groups and people who have been contributing to this debate over time, academics as well, and pressure groups. But what it really boils down to, and this is what we try to do with the recommendations of the report, is it requires legislative change just to make sure that it doesn't solve the problem by any stretch of the imagination, because it's a really complex socio-cultural issue that this is just a part of. But there are obvious baby steps that the government needs to take, and there's no reason why they shouldn't have already done this. Like, for example, ensuring that all which is something that Baroness Cox has been pushing for with her Marriage Act Amendment Bill, to ensure that all marriages, religious marriages, are registered. That is mandatory by law, and there are penalties if the marriage isn't registered. And if you do that, it also means that you can use the legislation that I mentioned earlier that was changed for Jewish women that were stuck in these chained marriages. They changed the Divorce Act so that the judge would be able to withhold the civil dissolution of the marriage until a religious divorce was given to the woman, so that they wouldn't end up stuck being divorced under civil law but still married under religious law. And the reason why some have suggested that wouldn't, even if you extended that to apply to Muslim women, wouldn't necessarily be useful in itself, is because it only works if the marriages are registered under civil law in the first place. So you have to do the two things in tandem. You have to change the Marriage Act, and you have to change divorce legislation as well. And there have been some suggestions as well. So in the Netherlands, the way that they've approached the issue is using tort law. So the way that they've approached it is that it's viewed as a sort of a harm, and that the judge can fine daily the husband however long he's refusing to give the religious divorce. So that solves one part of the problem. But we have to figure out how, with all of these different case studies and all of these different situations where what it really boils down to is just that the women are unprotected, the first thing that we have to do before we can see the rest of it clearly is to figure out how can we just protect them in the first instance, so at least they're safe. And then we can discuss all of the other things that are also issues, but are not necessarily as straightforward to solve.
Emma, I think the thing that you're saying is a really important piece of the jigsaw to put in, perhaps a corner piece or a centerpiece, in terms of shifting the way in which we talk about this, because we know that Sharia courts are operating, and that much of the community will go to them for to be the discerners of justice and so on within the Islamic communities that operate in our nation. But I think that we as a nation have to look at this. We've had Rotherham, we've had the stuff that goes on in Bradford, we know the stuff that's going on in Leeds, we've heard of some of the horrific cases in Luton, in Bedford. And yet, despite the horror of grooming gangs and all of these cases, I think a little bit, as you have said, Emma, it's as if we know about it, but we're not, and we hear these terrible stories, and women find it hard to speak and to talk, but we know of them, but there is no obvious change in culture. It's as if we're allowed to continue. We can't name it. We can't. It's as if it's allowed to continue to operate. And in the case that I mentioned before, going to the Sharia courts was one thing, but another was simply that even within the civil system, So the local councillors would all be familiarised with the people that that young woman was being abused by, and so there are real difficulties. So I think that what Emma's talking about and Baroness Cox's bill are really, really important, and that we need in processing all of this and in the campaign for change around it and these things, that we should educate in the public space, as we have done around female genital mutilation. Yes,
I think there's a comment a little bit about that, Andrea, and I think Roger wants to come in on some of the comments that we've been receiving.
Yes, there was a great comment from one of the viewers about education. Are Muslim women, particularly in populations where the schools are filled with more Muslim children, are they being told about their rights? Because obviously you're not required as a Muslim woman to go to a Sharia council for arbitration. You can go to a normal court. So the fact that women aren't doing that, where are they getting their information from, or where should they be getting their information from?
Well, you can only go to a civil court, a normal court, if your marriage is a marriage under UK law, and so that's one of the reasons why they find themselves dependent on the Sharia courts, because it's the only way that they actually can receive some kind of arbitration. So actually, the reality is that these councils, Sharia councils, have far more power than they should have
within the community.
Say within the British legal system, that the fact that there are women who don't have the option of going to the civil courts gives them far too much power within the system. But I also think that maybe it's counterintuitive for some people, but I think that in my experience talking to some of these women, it doesn't seem to be it's not a kind of like socio-economic divide. Like, some of the women who are not aware that their marriages aren't registered, or maybe they are aware and they just simply haven't registered their civil marriage, and there are lots of different and as many scenarios as there are people, but many of them are not non-native, as in they were born in many of them were born in the UK. They're, in some cases professional women who you would assume, there's not a language barrier there that's stopping them from, they're not integrated, as it were. But then obviously there are other women who are in different situations, and also they're more difficult to speak to because they're more difficult to access. And so really, from the perspective of a researcher, it's a kind of methodological point, but you can only speak to the people that you can access. And there are many women who will not be in a position to be accessed, and we don't know very much about, what their situation is. It could be much worse for all we know, or it might be that the situation for them is completely different. But I think, going back to what Andrea was saying, that some of the women that I spoke to explicitly said that they felt that they'd been let down by the UK, that when they needed the UK for help, there was no one there to help them, that they felt dismissed, they felt that the system was sort of stacked against them in some way. There's one quote that we mentioned early on in the report with an asylum seeker who said, we come to this country because we want protection, and then when we get here, we find that we're completely unprotected by the law. So I think that it is a case of just simply that it's kind of like the bread and butter stuff. Sometimes when you make policy recommendations and people are responding to it on social media or whatever, people will say, I can't believe that this is not already, why is this not already the law? It's the same with a report that I worked on a long time ago on charity law, and people said, how is it possible the Charity Commission can't unregister charities, just simply unregister them if they're bad? And this is another one of those instances where most people will be saying, but how is it possible that we can have marriages that are not registered and not recognised by civil law? And so I actually think in a way it's part of the process of like getting some clarity about what the situation is. At least once the marriages are registered, we know what we're dealing with, because at the moment it's just a blank spot. There's a whole area of unknown, and within that, who knows what, some people had raised some issues around child marriage. Because obviously
those are things that we've seen some of those as well come through into the office. Young girls being married off 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds being married off. We've had that sort of situation happening in places like Southampton, towns down in the west of England. So these things are happening. We had a young woman turn up to these offices with 2 plastic bags and her passport in because she'd be told that she would be brutalized unless she married, unless she entered into the arranged marriage that her parents had for her. But the thing again also that was extraordinary about this particular case was that she had gone to a London university and she had to always be veiled. And she said that not one white person had ever spoken to her throughout her whole period. Well, I think when we met her, she was going into her 3rd year of university. Do we really live in such a world where that is a reality? She, in fact, had been born and bred in London herself. So I was amazed at that when it happened. But also the reality for us was that she turned up on the doorstep, having fled from this arranged marriage. And I just want to say to anyone out there that we are here. We are always here. If you're in trouble, then Christian Concern is here to serve you, because we want to help people that are in situations of subjugation, that are hurting, that are seeking to flee from abusive situations. That is why we exist, to serve. And I think the other thing, Emma, to realize, just in terms of our own, of the reality, it's this: law does help to change the culture because it sets a standard. But even within the standard, there will be many that say, well, even if we are meant to register, this is what we believe in, and this should be sufficient. And I think in a world where we have so devalued marriage in the Great Britain, where it pretty much, it's no longer exclusively between a one-man, one-woman union for life. It can be between 2 men and 2 women. You're able to divorce with no fault. You can get out of it pretty much easier than getting out of your pension and most normal contracts. When we devalue marriage, and it comes to, and it just generally, again, culturally and in law, that will have an impact on how others see what they're registering into. And it's all these layers of complexity, I think, that make the situation difficult.
I think
okay. Go, Emma.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say that there under international law, there are things that we're signed up to. There's a convention that its acronym is CEDAW, and I can never remember exactly what it stands for, but it's something like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, something like that.
Roger, more about this at European level, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with these, there's a significant amount of problems with these, with CEDAW and with the Istanbul Convention, in that the original framers meant well, but they were individuals who hijacked the documents, putting in, for example, with CEDAW, they want to decriminalize abortion in every nation, irregardless of the laws there. With the Istanbul Convention, they want to define women as being transgender inclusive. So the first report they've done on violence against women in Austria included a section on transgenderism. So it's a problem of politics getting mingled in with good ideas and good intentions.
There are sections not just in the international, on the international side of things, but also, on domestic stuff, things like the Siddiqui inquiry into the application of Sharia law, the Casey review, the integrated community strategy, all of that, that it's quite clear that you shouldn't be privileging, the idea that, for example, when this has been put to people in Parliament, Baroness Cox has done this a number of times, the idea seems to be that, this is a social issue, not a legal issue. And I think, going back to what Andrea was saying, that there's this sense that, they're a separate community, and therefore we're not going to get involved with that. That it's almost like the women's rights don't matter because they're women from a particular community. And I think that, Dr. Elham Mania, who wrote the foreword for the report, and all of the activist women, the activist groups, and there's an amazing group called the Muslim Women's Advisory Council. I think that's right. I apologize if I've accidentally got that wrong. But you know, there are some fantastic groups who are doing really great work on this, and they seem to agree with each other that it's unacceptable to put, you know, to say, you know, because they're in this group that their human rights don't matter, or that it's fine for them to be discriminated against by the law because they're within a particular religious group. And I think that's the reason why it's, you know, it just seems like an obvious thing that the government should step in and just deal with the problem, because it's not like it's a complicated change. It's very straightforward.
One of the quite a lot of the comments have mentioned multiculturalism, including from John Winlow, who's commented a couple of times about that. I wonder if this doctrine of multiculturalism, by which has led to this idea that you really can't critique people from another culture, or any legal action that seems directed towards a particular culture is by default anti-Muslim or hateful in some way. What do the rest of the panel think about that?
Yeah, so I think that one of the criticisms of making registration mandatory has been that it singles out the Muslim community, though the bill itself that was proposed by Baroness Cox, this isn't just an issue for the Muslim community. I've spoken to some people who've said that there are other communities as well that do have, it's not in the same way. They don't have exactly the same sorts of challenges and problems, but there are other people who will be in marriages that are not registered, and that they would be facing exactly the same problems. It's just that it seems to be an issue that is particularly prevalent in the Muslim community, and that we've, you know, seen a lot of evidence of. But some people have said, you know, you're singling out the Muslim community, and some people that we have interviewed, including one of the women who was a victim of forced marriage, said that she felt that one of the reasons why the government has failed to deal with this is because they're afraid of being called Islamophobic. They don't want to be viewed as targeting a particular community, but in the process, they're essentially refusing to deal with a serious problem within that community that a community within the community is facing. So in a way, it does kind of link to the multiculturalism identity politics thing, because I think that there's a fear of dealing with the issue, or there's at least reluctance there, because it's a sensitive issue that's being viewed as something that is a social and cultural issue, rather than something that the law should be dealing with, even though every other community, you know, is quite well protected by legislation. And so anybody who believes in equality before the law would surely think that this is unacceptable. But I think that the fear caused by the identity politics and everything is possibly, or at least this is what was suggested to me by some of the interviewees, that this is something that is getting in the way.
And so, in fact, possibly the lack of requiring marriages to be registered ends up hitting a particular minority.
Yeah, it's ironic.
Even harder.
It's very ironic.
And we want to reach out and love our Muslim neighbours, and we want them to have the full protection of the law. We want their most vulnerable members to have the full protection of the law. We want them to know what's available to them. We want them not to be subjected to situations whereby they can be entirely bereft of all their belongings, bereft of their children, bereft of any advocacy, bereft of any recourse to justice. So we in this are really reaching out to our Muslim neighbours and seeking a good framework in law, a good access to justice. That is it. That is what we're seeking here, and that's what Baroness Cox and Emma, with her work, have long been working for, with regard to the amendments to the marriage laws.
Just one more question I want to throw in from CA on YouTube. Question for the panel: how feasible is it for two parallel legal systems to operate in a single jurisdiction? Roger, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Well, I mean, the Sharia councils operate by agreement. They're arbitration councils, more or less, yet their opinions are binding. The issue with those is that, as we see here, women don't know their legal rights outside of that. And so not just with the issue of marriage, I accept that these aren't legally registered marriage, but when it comes to domestic abuse, custody issues, inheritance, anything that touches the life of a married partner, they're not availing themselves of the courts. Part of it is a fear of being ostracized from the community, or a fear of violence. Part of it is just ignorance as to knowing that they can do so. So that is, to me, the most fundamental flaw of this type of legal system. On the other side, yeah, we do work with parallel legal systems all the time. We have a European system. We work with international legal systems. We have a domestic system. So in that sense, as long as it's all within the rule of law and not working against each other, it is feasible.
But I think you've hit it on the head there, Roger, within the rule of law. And you can't have a separate, the kind of international binding conventions or the international treaties or the international legal systems that work in parallel are complementary. And the way in which the way in which we can access them is open to all and open via the various systems. But when it comes to Sharia councils, they're for one community only. They don't recognize the national law, and sometimes operate as if the national law does not exist, or that they are not subject to it. So that is very serious, particularly if you have vulnerable members, vulnerable citizens of the United Kingdom that cannot access, that are not equal and free, that cannot access justice, that cannot be looked after well. And so that is why the education exercise is so important, why a political campaign is so important, but also a cultural campaign is so very important. If a community chooses to bind itself by its own laws, if those laws do not concur with the national system, so if you have polygamous marriages in effect operating, well, that's illegal, and that needs to be that conflict of law, as it were, needs to be named, it needs to be dealt with, and those that are made vulnerable within that system need to be shown where and how to access justice.
I just want to bring up a comment on Facebook. It's a fairly provocative one from James Linton. It says, Andrea, you are imposing your own culture upon Muslims. This will earn you the label of white supremacist. They choose to live and abide by the Islamic theocracy / Sharia. Leave them be. Now, I think it's an interesting point. I think that would be a failure of love on our part. What do you think, Andrea?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we exist to bring the good news of Jesus Christ and all the good things that flow from him, which is this idea of the innate dignity of every human being, every citizen, and we want to do right by them. And we don't want women that are hurting, that are harmed, that are subjugated. We don't want children that are being pushed into arranged marriages within this country. We don't want women that are being subject to Sharia marriages, the laws that go around that in terms of custody of children. We want them to be free. We want them to be able to access justice. It's really important. Very often when they are, part of their subjugation is because they are in fear of the Sharia law that is imposed, is imposed upon them. Very often that's not even by their own choice.
I want to, it brings up this issue of what true freedom is, doesn't it? Because some people think freedom as purely freedom from external constraints. So freedom from a law that tells you to do something, or from other people imposing their will on you, but also freedom can be a matter of internal trappedness. So a woman, for example, a Muslim woman trapped in one of these marriages, can feel that they are in a situation where they just cannot leave this person because it would be unfaithful. There are internal freedoms to be dealt with as well as external ones. Roger, you wanted to talk about
that. Interestingly, Paul, though, you see, it's not always just within a Sharia situation. as when I started out as a young lawyer, I dealt with lots of domestic abuse situations, and those women will keep on going back to their abusers. You know, this is kind of so, and I used to be amazed at that. So that even though they were accessing the justice system, there was a sense in which they were not free too, because they would go back they would go back, but not because they had access to the legal system. They knew that it was there, but they would return to where they were subjugated. And you know, the message of the gospel is that the truth sets you free, and actually understanding who you are, precious, made in the image of God, and that you can be free in Him, you can be forgiven and free, is one of the is the kind of good news message that we want to bring to our nation, and which has served us well for so long.
Yeah, I would just like to add that not many of our supporters might know this, but we were involved in a very important case with the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights dealing with the issue of parallel courts. It was a case against Greece, which involved a Sharia court and the domestic courts. And the job of the European Court was to determine whether Sharia can have hierarchy over a domestic court in a Council of Europe member state. And during that period, we exposed precisely what Emma is talking about how women are treated under Sharia, the lack of their ability to join society in the way that other members have. In that case, you had the 17 judges ruling that Sharia could not take precedence over the domestic regime of the Council of Europe member state. And I don't think anyone has called those 17 judges white supremacists, just for the record. But it was an important ruling, and I'm very proud of the Christian Legal Center for having intervened in that case.
We're just coming to the end of our time here. I want to first thank Emma very, very much for joining us today. I do want to ask her one final question, which is your report's sort of not necessarily aimed at the typical layperson, although they could absolutely read it, and I think we've put the link in the comments. Is there any action that our viewers could really take to help on this issue? And do you think there's anything that churches in particular could do to look out for women who are stuck in this sort of situation?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that I think it's an issue for everyone, not just going back to what you were saying about parallel legal systems and the whole white supremacist thing. You know, Dr. Elham Mania made a really important point about this in her book when she said that, her book on women in Sharia law, when she said that if you have parallel legal systems, then it always degenerates into discrimination. It's bad for everyone, not just for the group concerned. So I think that everybody should be bearing in mind that, you know, we should be trying to get the divorce and marriage laws changed as much as possible. So if people could write to their MPs and say, you need to take this seriously, this is an issue for all of us, and in that sense to sort of show solidarity with these women who are very, you know, they've been alienated by their experiences. I think it would be really meaningful for people to say, you know, this is an issue for all of us, and we're going to stand with these women and make it clear to our MPs and in any capacity that we have in our lives to try to push forward the case for getting this legislation changed, and just to try and raise more awareness. I think churches could probably do some work, even if, you know, some churches do interface work and things like that. There must be some capacity there for trying to spread awareness about marriage registration and what it means if it turns out that your marriage isn't properly registered, that you need to be sure that it is. But I think the most important thing really that any everyday person could do is write to your MP, look at the policy recommendations in the report. It's in the summary of the report and in the conclusion. Write to your MP and say, this is something that you need to be supporting, because we need to have more popular support for it. We can't just leave it to these women to deal with it, you know, on their own. They need other people behind them.
Thank you so much. That's a good place to leave it today. Reminding people, look, you can do something about this. It can be quite simple. You can just email your MP. I want to share something that we do at Christian Concern. On Fridays, we send out a Christian Weekly News email. So if you're not already receiving that, please do sign up. You can go to christianconcern.com/hello if you want to get that email. And we send it out every Friday. I'm significantly involved in typing it out and working out what goes in there. And we'll definitely have some links for you on this issue, and linking to the report and helping you out with emailing your MP about it. So please do sign up at christianconcern.com/hello. That would be really helpful to us to get that information. And if you can do it quickly, then you will be in time to get this week's email. So I want to say another big thank you to Emma and to Andrea and Roger for joining us today. And I hope that you can join us again on a future week for our live streams on Friday lunchtimes. Thanks very much for being with us.